You were born. You opened your eyes for the first time. You heard your mother's voice. You took your first steps. You said your first word. And you remember none of it. Not a single moment. You lived an entire life before you turned 3. Thousands of days. The hands that carried you, fed you, rocked you to sleep. The faces that leaned over you with love. The whole person you were back then vanished without a trace. Most people assume the answer is simple, that your brain was just too small to remember anything. But that's not true. And the real answer is far stranger than you'd think, because your infant brain wasn't failing to record your life. It was recording everything. Your memories were there. Something destroyed them. And right alongside what erased them lies something discovered only recently. Something that has scientists no longer sure whether those memories vanished at all, or were only locked away somewhere. This phenomenon has a name: childhood amnesia. Over a century ago, Sigmund Freud described it, and it was he who coined the term. He claimed you repressed those memories because they were too uncomfortable. That part turned out to be wrong. But the phenomenon itself is entirely real, and it happens to every human being on Earth. Let's start with something that sounds like a contradiction of the whole puzzle. Infants can remember. We know this for a fact. In the 1980s, the psychologist Carolyn Rovee-Collier of Rutgers University devised a simple, brilliant experiment. She tied a ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile hanging over the crib. The baby quickly discovered that kicking moved the mobile, and it was delighted. When she came back with the same baby a few days later, it remembered. It started kicking right away at the sight of the mobile. A 2-month-old held that memory for a few days. A 6-month-old for whole weeks. What's more, a single small reminder could refresh that trace and stretch it even longer. It really was in there. So the infant brain can learn, it can store information, it can recall it, and yet those memories don't stay. By adulthood, every trace of them is gone, and for decades, science couldn't fully explain why. The first part of the answer is structural. Deep in your brain sits a small, curved structure, the hippocampus. It's the engine of memory formation. It takes a lived moment and encodes it as an episode you can later replay in your mind. But in an infant, this system is still under construction. The connections between the hippocampus and the cortex are still forming. Key regions aren't fully wired until somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4. So your infant brain could form short-term memories. It just couldn't move them into long-term storage the way an adult brain does. But that's only half the story. And what comes next is stranger still. In 2014, 2 neuroscientists in Toronto, Josselyn and Paul Frankland, put forward a hypothesis that sounds almost absurd. What if the very process that builds your brain is also the one that destroys your memories? In the first years of life, your hippocampus produces new neurons at an unimaginable rate. The phenomenon is called neurogenesis. Those new cells wire up the circuits you'll use for the rest of your life. But Josselyn and Frankland suspected there was a price. Every time a new neuron slots into an existing circuit, it tears apart the connections that were already there. Exactly the ones holding your memories. They tested it in mice. When they artificially cranked up neurogenesis in adult mice, they started forgetting things they'd previously learned. And when they slowed it down in young mice, those young mice held their memories longer than normal. The conclusion, published in the journal Science, was counterintuitive. Your infant brain wasn't too weak to hold memories. It was too busy growing. The same explosion of new neurons that built your brain overwrote what was inside it. You didn't lose your first years because they were never saved. You lost them because your brain was building new rooms, tearing down the old walls in the process. But there's a second layer, and maybe the strangest one of all. For a memory of your own life to form, one where you are the main character of the scene, you need something most people take for granted. You need a sense of self. You have to understand that you exist as a separate person, that things are happening to you. In 1979, the psychologists Michael Lewis and Jean Brooks-Gunn devised a simple test for this. They painted a discrete dot of rouge on a child's nose and stood it in front of a mirror. Before 18 months, the infant treats the reflection like another child. It doesn't reach for the mark on its own face. After 18 months, suddenly it does. It understands that the person in the mirror is itself. And that moment, the birth of self-recognition, lines up with the earliest age from which we can remember anything at all. In other words, you can't remember being a baby partly because there was no you yet. There was no narrator in your head packaging experiences into a story that belonged to someone called you, which leads to an uncomfortable question. If you had no continuous sense of self and the brain that held your first experiences later rebuilt itself beyond recognition, neuron by neuron, then is the baby in your old photos really you? Or someone else who lived in the same body before becoming you? There's one last element: language. Before you could speak, your experiences were stored as raw impressions, sounds, textures, light, emotions. But with no words to organize them, those impressions had nothing to attach to. Only when a child starts to speak, and especially to talk with adults about what happened, remember when we went to the park, does its ability to form lasting memories rise sharply. Language gives memory a skeleton. Without it, experiences are like water with no container. They're there for a moment, and then they're gone. And this isn't just theory. You can measure it across cultures. In a 2000 study by Harleen Hain, adults from 3 groups in New Zealand were compared. Those of Asian descent reached back on average only to about 4 3/4 years old. New Zealanders of European descent to about 3.5, and Maori all the way to 2.5, a full year earlier than the rest of the world. Where does the difference come from? The key is the story. Maori culture places enormous emphasis on the past and on family stories, told richly with detail and emotion. The researcher Elaine Reese of the University of Otago followed children from infancy into adolescence and found something simple. The ones whose parents talked about the past in an elaborate way reached back as teenagers earlier and more fully. So your earliest memory doesn't begin where your brain began. It begins where someone began talking with you about it. You're probably thinking now, hold on, I do have a clear memory from before I was 3. I remember it exactly. You almost certainly don't. What you feel as a memory from those years is nearly always a reconstruction. Your brain assembled it from a photo on the wall and a story told at the table 100 times. It stitched together a plausible scene and filed it as if you'd really lived it. Studies show that people vividly remember events that only ever happened in a photograph. So sometime, check your earliest memory. It may turn out to be someone else's keepsake that you inherited. Now put it all together. Your hippocampus wasn't ready to build lasting memories, and when it started to, the flood of new neurons tore through the circuits that held them. You had no sense of self yet to pin them to, and you had no language to give them a shape that could survive. It wasn't one thing. It was everything at once, and for a long time it was assumed the effect was final, that those memories are simply erased, that they're gone. And then, in 2025, a team at Yale University did something that had seemed impossible. They slid awake 1-year-old infants into a scanner and watched their brains live. And they saw the infant hippocampus light up, encoding new memories from around the first year of life. That flips the whole puzzle. Because if the memories are being recorded, then maybe they aren't being erased. Maybe they're only locked. The file still sits untouched, but the key to it has been lost. One more study supports this. That same Toronto team was able to artificially switch back on early memories in adult mice that seemed long lost, proving they had been physically there the whole time. I'll be honest, this is fresh, unsettled science. We don't yet know how deep it goes or whether these memories could ever be recovered in a human, but the line has shifted from deleted to unreachable. One last question remains. Why does the brain do this at all? Because this forgetting isn't a flaw. It's the price of a brain plastic enough to learn everything at once in just a few years. In that same period, more than 1 million new neural connections form in a child's head every second, more than at any later point in life. Your head was the most intense construction site you will ever see. In those first years, your brain wasn't recording experiences, it was building the machine, learning to see, to walk, to speak, to understand the world. And those are things that stay with you forever. It sacrificed individual memories to build the person who is even capable of remembering anything. And there's something in this that's hard to make peace with. That earliest version of you really existed, but it's left only in someone else's memory. Your parents carry in their heads a person you yourself will never meet. You, before memory. So the baby you were, learning to walk, saying its first word, looking up at the faces that loved it, didn't vanish because it didn't matter. It vanished because your brain was too busy becoming you. Someone who would one day ask where it had gone. You'll never remember your own beginning, but someone remembers it for you. And to that someone, it was everything.